Hello and welcome back to Bicycle Legs Talks Music and another episode of Favorite Albums of All Time. And can you please welcome back to the channel one of my favorite guests of all time, Mr. Peter Kerr from Rock Daydream Nation. Peter, always a pleasure to have you on the channel.
Fantastic to be back. Thanks for the invite, and really looking forward to talking some craft work.
Yeah. So as you will have seen from the thumbnail of this video, today we are talking about this album right here, Kraftwerk, The Man Machine, or as Peter is going to show you, the Mensch Machine, the
Yes.
German version. And in particular, we're going to do this show a little bit differently than we normally do a favorite albums of all time show, in as much as we're going to use this album as a jumping point to ask an important question, I think. And the question that we're going to be asking is, did this album invent 80s music in 1978? So, Peter, how did you first get into Kraftwerk? Because, it's a big, long catalogue, and as we were discussing offline, there's definitely different eras with this band, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I think it might have been Triple J Hot 100. Autobahn always used to get voted quite highly. I think it even made the top 10 or top 20. Correct me if I'm wrong, viewers, but that's my recollection. It used to get played a lot on Double J and Triple J, and when they had their end of year polls of the best song of all time, Autobahn always was right up in the charts. So Autobahn was the entry point. Then in the countdown era, the model, which we'll talk about, of this album. And look, just being a fan of synth pop, new wave, just digging into that sort of genre of music, you cannot help but be touched by Kraftwerk because their fingerprints are over everything. So
Mm.
many bands have plagiarized their sound, their riffs, and I think it was my love of synth pop music in the 80s inspired me to be musically curious and dig and get back in, go into craft work. And I had the pleasure of seeing them a couple of times. I saw them in the big day out. I guess I'm putting my memory on the spot, maybe 15 years ago. There they were in their suits behind the laptops. I don't know what they were doing, Daniel. They could have been on eBay, but it was a great live show. And then I saw him again about 5 years after that at the Sydney Opera House, where it was a 3D interactive show, and they just did one album. So my wife and I, we put the 3D glasses and just sat back, and they did the one of their early albums, I think the Trans-American Express or whatever it is, and that was fantastic. So that's
Yeah.
just a quick summary of my love for this band.
Yeah, absolutely. I probably came at this band from two different directions. One being the similar one to you, with sort of, the early 80s synth pop sort of bringing me into their stuff. But also, I had in very early, sort of my teenage years, a love of more eclectic sort of electronic music. And I'm thinking, stuff like Jean-Michel Jarre and that sort of thing. So I came at it from that angle as well. Um, so, so it was a bit of a double banger for me to get into craft work. And yeah, I mean, just such an influential band. And, it took a while, but I'm so glad that this band finally got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Uh, because I didn't see that coming, to be honest. So,
Well, it was a little bit of a. I mean, they've been up so many times,
mm,
and they just got passed over. But just to naysayers like me, outsiders, there's, you know, they're so influential. It was just
yeah.
inconceivable that they would be left out.
Yeah, and funnily enough, when they did finally get inducted, they got inducted in the influencers category too. So,
Yeah,
um, you know,
absolutely.
quite appropriate. So let's have a little bit of a talk about their catalog. We're going to focus on this album, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other albums as well. Because, I mean, they started off, sort of early 70s. They were very much part of that early 70s krautrock scene. Um, it wasn't all about the synthesizers and the sequencers at the beginning, was it? It was more about they were playing guitars and flutes and violins and things like that. And yeah, they didn't have the corporate look yet, did they? They're much more sort of hippified in that early stuff. And this music, the early music is all instrumental too. There's no vocals on those first three albums, and it's very, they're playing more traditional instruments, but they're processing the hell out of them, just completely messing around with them, filtering them through, various audio filters and all that sort of thing, isn't it? It's not easy listening music. It's definitely something you've got to have a bit of a taste for, I think, but it's definitely very interesting, isn't it?
It is, and it's kind of proggy, very jazzy, very avant-garde, and completely different to what you would expect. But I think if you're going to map a journey with Kraftwerk, those first two albums, which incidentally are very hard to get, so
Mm.
I put it up there. That was like a bootleg, folks. I was just talking to Daniel off camera and saying if I had an original, it would be worth a pretty penny. Just look it up on Discogs, folks, because they're
Mm.
pretty hard to get in first pressing. So that's the first part of the story. But I think the next landmark album is Autobahn. And
Yeah,
that's where it
absolutely.
started to chart. They changed their sound. They went in, simplified their sound. Their song structures were very sort of minimalist. It was very sort of compressed, less flowery in respect of their melody lines, and they stuck to a theme. And I guess they started to explore, their surroundings, because I always relate Kraftwerk to be a very environmental band, a very environmental. They're very German in the sense of industry, technology, but through music, through the prism of music, and they're very clinical and efficient. And like German, Germany has one of the most, you know, the most efficient motorways in all of Europe, of the world. And I just think that album is a perfect synergy between, it's sort of like the motorways of Europe, but with music, and mapping it, over those various tracks on that album. So it's a complete change in music from being prog and avant-garde and stripping it down into something that was sort of like a soundtrack, a
Yeah,
soundtrack of against the roadways and the industry of Germany. And they were using very early sequences, synthesizers, and that laid the path. And
yeah.
Trans Europe, and sorry, apology, I did misspeak earlier. Trans Europe
Mm.
Express, those other two albums that followed it were sort of the same theme, where they picked a particular industry and a theme and wrapped it around that. And then with this album in 1978, they went completely to the future with robots. So
Yeah,
it's harking to Isaac Asimov and the great science fiction writers and the futurists. And, like Germany has a history of science fiction, Metropolis. Maybe it even harks back to some of those early tales of science fiction. But it was sort of one eye on the future, robots. And then sonically, it was a very listening to what was in the clubs. And it's a groundbreaking album because it's even more minimalist. It's even more, there's no humor. The words and lyrics are sparse. And it laid the blueprint for modern music, whether it's club, dance, synth pop, new wave. So I'm
Yeah.
rambling on a bit, but
Yeah,
this
no, no.
album, you cannot underestimate how influential this album is. So I think it's in.
Yeah.
I actually, if I was putting a marker on Kraftwerk, it'd be the first two albums, Autobahn, and this album. That's the
Yeah.
important markers in their discography.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And there's definitely, Autobahn set up where they were going to go because it's the first side one, which is like a side-long epic. The title track Autobahn is the first thing that they'd done, which was completely electronic, as opposed to, more traditional instruments that were processed and all that sort of thing. Autobahn, the track is, completely synthesizers, sequencers, electronic drums that they built themselves. I love those little drum kits that they used to have in the 70s, and they'd play them with these little metal sticks that looked like knitting needles. And but then side two of Autobahn sort of harks back to those first two albums because you've still got the flute and that sort of thing on the tracks on side two. But side one definitely pointing where they're going to go with that minimalist sound, with that all electronic sound. And then, as you say, the next two albums, Radioactivity and then Trans Europe Express, they've got a similar theme going to them. They're all electronic, but they're definitely more mood music, much like Autobahn was. And I still think they're great, great, wonderful albums. But I don't think they quite showed where they were going to get to with this, because this, I think, is influential and a breakthrough album for them as far as sort of, the concept of this show, where I'm saying they invented 80s music with this album, because this is more song based. It's, definitely got more beat to it. As you say, it's got an eye in the clubs. It's got a foot in that kind of camp. They're still got the experimental thing going on and the German electronica kind of thing, but they're definitely also got a foot in Studio 54 and that sort of thing. So, um, and yeah, definitely more song based. Some of these songs have, you know, full on lyrics rather than just little chanted bits like you get on Autobahn. And absolutely, we're gonna, pick out a few, I think, highlights on this album that we think sort of really point to where they're going to go as far as British music in the early 80s is going to go and take this and just, you know, invent synth pop, as it were. But
Yeah. Well, I think we've got to talk about We Are the Robots. That's part of
yeah,
their song list. And every time I hear that, I feel like I feel like doing that because it is just so mechanical, so precise. Now, Germany is renowned for their precision, Daniel.
mm,
Whether it's technology, whether it's their soccer team, they are absolutely stone cold precision. And this song is just so precise. There's not one beat out of place. And, you know, put it through the a metaphor of a robot, or we are the robots. And I just think it's a marriage made in heaven.
yeah,
And it I think this really set up the mystique of Kraftwerk with the imagery of the band. I'm just quickly turning around just to grab some photos. There you go.
yeah,
You know, um, Devo.
yeah,
They must have had an eye on that. Even bands like I was just thinking Franz Ferdinand, even
mm,
stylistically with their album covers, have
yeah,
copied
absolutely.
that and the look.
Yeah,
Um, it's sort of semi cultish. So sound, vision, sound and vision, they've created something that is totally unique and absolutely influential. And, you know, We Are the Robots is just basically a couple of melody lines that is repeated and repeated and repeated. And that's basically modern dance music.
Mm, absolutely. A couple of things I just wanted to quickly pick up on when you were talking about the visuals is, yeah, that to me, that cover, it's a combination of two things. It's something you mentioned earlier, which is that, sort of movies like Metropolis and that sort of thing. But then it's also sort of Soviet realism. And you
Yes.
get that in the song The Robots as well, because they actually have a couple of lines that are in Russian. So so you get that as well. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out with the song The Robots is I actually played this record for somebody this afternoon before we recorded this show. And it was her first time hearing Kraftwerk at all. And I put the robots on at the beginning of the album, and she said two things to me. First, she said, "Wow, this sounds good." Just the quality of the audio is just second to none. Absolutely crystal clear. And the other thing she said to me, just again picking up on something you said, was she said, "Sounds like Devo."
Yeah.
So, and it
Well,
does it does kind of sound like Devo, but it doesn't sound like Devo from 1978. It sounds like Devo from 1982.
yeah, but it's a sound that hasn't dated. And isn't it
Mm,
funny that a lot of the synth pop and a lot of the synthesizers and the old school synths and sequences in that era had that timeless quality, but in the chase for technology, when you got into the 80s, there were a lot of sounds like the drum machines, the sort of certain tones that we use sound so dated. They sound so tinny and dated, and you
mm,
just listen to it, it's like 80s. But you listen to this, you'd have to pinch yourself and say, wow, 1978. Now, this is 1978. Now, what's in 78? Post punk, disco,
yeah,
funk. This is totally unique, absolutely totally unique. And just to think, artists like Herbie Hancock with Rocket, which completely rips off this song, came out in 1984. You know, and this is another thing. As we go through this show, folks, I'm going to just throw little bands at bicyclelegs and say, "Wow, this has been stolen." So that's the first one
yeah,
off the bat. You know, that song Rocket.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, there you go. And it's interesting too. When synthesizer music really came to be in the forefront of pop culture in the early 80s, there were so many different sounds that they could have chosen because synthesizers had been around, well, since the very late 60s even. There's Moog synthesizer on Abbey Road. So, synthesizers had been around. They'd mostly been used in the early 70s in progressive rock bands, your Yeses and your Emerson, Lake and Palmers and things like that. When synth pop bands came around and they were looking for the synth sounds that they were going to use, they didn't go to those sounds from the early 70s and the prog rock bands and all that sort of thing. They went to Kraftwerk and they used sounds like that. As you say, they didn't do it as well as Kraftwerk because, as you say, some of those sounds definitely sound more dated than this does. But this is the palette that they were using rather than the palette of those sort of big Moog synthesizers and things like that from the early to mid 70s. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Australian invention, the Fairlight, changed everything. Where multi-tracking, sampling different sounds and doing this big wall of sound. And Trevor Horn, one of my favorite producers all time, can be held responsible through that the ZTT label with Frankie Goes to Hollywood, where everything was just bigger and more bombastic. But if
Mm.
you look at a lot of those synth pop bands, which are so much the bastard children of Kraftwerk, and I'm looking at you, Human League, as an example, or Ultravox, those early albums were so Kraftwerk, it's not funny, where there
Mm.
are licks and melody lines. Like I was just saying, like Dare,
Yeah.
that's Kraftwerk with a twist of pop, you know, a little bit
Yeah.
of fizzy twist of pop in it. That's so much like that late period, that late 70s Kraftwerk.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I really think, just my final point, I really think
Yeah.
synth music is that can be put into two periods. It's that craft work, that very simplistic sequence of sort of sounds, and then you got the Fairlight where it just went bombastic. And that was
Yeah.
probably responsible for a lot of the sounds that they were sampling, making that music sound very dated, because
Mm.
it sort of lost its charm. There wasn't that minimalist sort of sound that makes a lot of this music very compelling.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I wanted to pick up again on something you were mentioning. I mean, I was actually playing that Human League album Dare this afternoon as well, and sort of going, can you hear the influence? Um, which absolutely you can. But also, I'm going to put up on the screen as we're talking here now the cover of Ultravox's Vienna, and tell me that that does not take some sort of influence from the Man Machine.
Yeah,
The visuals of it, not just the music of it, but the
I,
visuals as well.
absolutely. And when they have those little synth lines that sound like a violin or a viola or an oboe, that
Mm.
comes in, because there is a little bit of melody in this album that comes in. It's like a palate cleanser. One song, and I am jumping the gun a little bit. Neon
Yeah,
Lights.
no, no.
I wrote down. That is such a
Mm.
Human League. That's Human
Yeah,
League before Human League. You can't tell me that song did not influence the Dare album, and
yeah.
even the dispassionate vocals. So, the vocals are very robotic, a little bit, pitchy, a little bit wavery, not a traditional singer. Um, you know, the vocal stylizations of this album really opened it up for your Gary Newmans and your Phil Oakleys, that we don't have to sing, we don't have to croon. Just
Mm.
just get in a, roughly within key, follow the melody line, and voila.
Just as you're talking there, we've been talking about Human League for a while. I find that the comparison between this album and Dare are very tangible. But I'm thinking of the first two Human League albums, which are even more minimalist and experimental.
Being boiled,
They,
travelogue.
yeah,
Yep.
they remind me of the two albums that came before this one. They sound more like your Radioactivity and your Trans Europe Express. So it's like the Human League were following the template that was laid down by Kraftwerk, but like 3 or 4 years down the track, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So,
And this album got a second lease of life, because when it was first released, it didn't chart that well in the UK. But I think it got had a second lease of life in '82, and it actually went top 10, probably off the back of the Model
yeah.
song, which, out of all the songs, ironically, has a little bit of heart to it. I was thinking,
Mm.
like, of all the songs that have whimsy and heart and bit of humanity, that's probably one of the only songs on the album. Would you agree? It's a bit of an
Yeah,
outrider, that song.
absolutely. And the funny thing is too, I think it's also the shortest song on the album, and it's also the probably most traditional pop song on the album. As in the structure of the song, not in the sound. The sound is completely unlike anything that was happening in 1978, which is probably why it took until 1982 for it to be a top 10 hit in the UK. Because it was actually what happened was it was released as the B-side to one of the songs off the Computer World album. And it was one of those situations like, Kiss's Beth, where it was the B-side and it got flipped over and all the DJs were playing that. And it probably took until 1982 for music taste to catch up to the point where the model sounded like it was, you know, in place because it was, years ahead of its time.
Absolutely. And they had that delightful film clip that showed all these different sort of clips from old Hollywood movies, and it had a little bit of glamour, and it sort of fit in with those clips from Visage and Duran Duran. It was had that, they did a clip that sort of fit in with the new romanticism of that early '80s period.
Well, yeah, and again, you keep reminding me of things that I want to talk about, Peter, and I love that. Going back to this cover, look at the guys on that cover. What is, apart from the fact that it looks like, something from the 1920s, Metropolis, that sort of thing, what's the other thing you notice about these guys? They're wearing makeup.
Very a lot of androgyny, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And again, ahead of its time because it wasn't until the early 80s that that look would really get adopted by a lot of these synth pop bands. Again, your Phil Oakey, he would wear the lipstick, he would have the strange haircut with, all the hair on one side sort of thing. And you'd get your really androgynous people like Boy George and all that sort of thing. But even then you'd get your, soft cell and Mark Armand, he had the short hair, but he had the makeup, he'd have the lipstick and the eyeliner and all that sort of thing. So again, years ahead of their time visually as well as in the audio department.
yeah, 110%. Uh, this album's very economical. It only goes to 28 minutes. There's not that many songs on it. Doesn't outstay its welcome. Everything is in the right spot, and I think it's just there's just so much precision.
Mm,
And these guys are quite mysterious. I don't know a lot about them.
yeah.
And I think that adds to the mystique of Kraftwerk. Um, you know, I think they're very private individuals, and even on stage, you don't know what they do, but it adds to the mystique of this wonderful band.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one last song I wanted to talk about before we move on, Peter, is the song Metropolis. Because even though it's only got sort of there's really no lyric to that song except the title Metropolis. But musically, I feel like this is one of the most influential songs. I'm thinking of a band like, now, one of the bands that we haven't discussed yet that definitely have a Kraftwerk influence, but they're the first people to tell you that they have a Kraftwerk influence, is Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. OMD. They even have been said to, that they formed OMD after going to a Kraftwerk concert in Liverpool. So, that was sort of the inspiration for them to form the band in the first place. And I definitely hear some of that really early OMD in a song like Metropolis. What do you reckon?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got to talk about Gary Newman. So
Mm,
he's definitely influenced by Kraftwerk, but with a bit of Bowie. So Newman was more, he still had that rock sensibility because those early albums, he still had instruments, but he, eventually did give it up for a period of time. But, undoubtedly, the repetitive, simple, catchy, hooky, keyboard lines definitely, were, you know, in Gary's head listening to Kraftwerk. So there's no doubt. And even that sort of outer worldly alien look, that's not too far removed from, you know, these guys. And, that's not like human, isn't it? It's like robotic.
mm.
So it's all in the same wheelhouse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Gary Newman. he has more of a rock aesthetic because he started off as a punk, which, obviously Kraftwerk didn't start off as punks. They started off as these sort of strange, sort of hippie guys in the early krautrock and all that sort of thing. So they were coming at it from different angles. But then I've heard Gary Newman tell the story over and over again about how he went into the studio to make a punk album and somebody had left behind a synthesizer and he just started messing around with it and one thing led to another. So, but you have to think he was listening to these Kraftwerk albums before he sort of made that journey into what he did. Certainly from the aesthetic, as you say, vocally, absolutely, but also lyrically. You know, a song like Cars just owes such a debt to Kraftwerk and that sort of thing, doesn't it?
Well, I'll tell you what, this show is building up steam because I just had a light bulb go off in my head. Um, Gary Newman's been sort of spoken about as the godfather of industrial music.
Yeah,
So if you've got a tree, Kraftwerk, Gary Newman, industrial music, even Depeche Mode, that's another band. Those early Depeche Mode where it was all electronica before, um, Martin, got the guitar and did Personal Jesus, and they were exploring using electrified guitars and drums and real instruments. Boy, oh boy, were they Kraftwerk.
yeah.
But, you know, Kraftwerk, Gary Newman, exploring electronic music, but with a harder range, melded with rock, industrial music.
Yeah.
So there's a connection there. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Depeche Mode are an interesting one because that first Depeche Mode album with Vince Clarke is pure pop. And then after that, Vince Clarke sort of left the band after that very first Depeche Mode album, and Martin Gore took over the songwriting and that sort of thing. And that's when it started to get more clunky and industrial and all that sort of thing.
And
So that's an
lyrically,
interesting,
it went dark.
yeah,
Started
absolutely.
exploring topics like S&M and master and servant and domination, and really
Yeah.
dark. They become the sort of the darkness. But yeah, we're going a little bit off track here. But yeah, there's linkage to Kraftwerk.
Mm,
I even put bands like The Cure. People go, oh, there's linkage.
mm.
There's this band has not. There are very few bands in synth pop or popular music in the 80s that haven't been touched in some way by Kraftwerk and that album.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what a great discussion. I mean, this has been a really interesting one, I think, to talk about this album, an album that you and I, Peter, both absolutely love. Um, and, this all came about because I mentioned Kraftwerk somewhere in some other show, and you were in the live chat when the show was premiering, and I said, "Oh, I must do a Kraftwerk show sometime." And you said to me, "Well, if you do that, you've got to have me on for that." So
Yeah,
thank you for the encouragement there to do this show because it's been absolutely wonderful.
absolutely. Just one more thing before we wrap it up.
Yeah.
Another band that we should do a shout out that were kind of in a parallel laneway, but probably didn't have that sort of fame as Tangerine Dream.
Mm.
But they went down a different route. They went down the soundtrack route, but they were definitely pioneers of electronic music. So they're worth exploring.
Oh,
And
look.
I've done a show with Davey Gallagher on Rock Daydream Nation, and we were exploring some of the soundtracks of Tangerine Dream. But I find those two kind of were parallel, but not
Yeah.
didn't have that sort of strong image and that stylistic direction perhaps that
Yeah.
Kraftwerk did, but very sonically very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Tangerine Dream, more of a sort of they went more for the longer pieces, the ambient tracks. They didn't have vocals on their on a couple of their albums they did, but on the whole they were an instrumental band. And yeah, they rather than going towards the more pop route that Kraftwerk went, they went more towards the soundtrack kind of thing. So Tangerine Dream are a band I have a bunch of albums of, but I have twice as many of their albums that I don't own because they just did so many. There's a ridiculous number of Tangerine Dream albums out there, and they're probably all worth owning. So
Yeah, well, there's one song on this album, the Man Machine. It's called Space Lab, and I
mm,
wrote down Tangerine Dream because it's got
yeah,
that pulsating feel. The trademark Tangerine Dream synth line is this pulsating, chiming keyboard line, and you've got this percussion under it. Risky business. You know, if you remember the train scene, folks, you'll understand what I'm
mm,
talking about. It's their signature sound. And there you have it. You've got Kraftwerk with this pulsating sort of rhythm and sound. And I was just thinking very much like Tangerine Dream. So
yeah,
it's these two bands sort of interwove at various times. And I think
yeah,
that worth mentioning, both from Germany.
yeah. Absolutely. And, but they were from slightly different scenes because Tangerine Dream were from Berlin, Kraftwerk were from Dusseldorf, and they were definitely different music scenes. So there was some cross-pollination there for sure, but there's also some subtle differences between the two bands, and they're both absolutely fabulous and well worth exploring.
Tangerine Dream were much, I'd probably say, more proggy, especially their earlier
Yeah.
stuff. Would you say? Yeah,
Oh,
definitely.
absolutely. Yeah. So, and just an extra little shout out if we're going to be talking about electronic German music. There's a guy I've only recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, really gotten into because I managed to pick up a couple of his albums really cheap. Definitely more on the Tangerine Dream side than the Kraftwerk side, and that's a guy called Klaus Schulze. And if you ever see any of his albums, pick them up because they're absolutely wonderful, but total space music. Completely electronic, but total space music. Absolutely wonderful stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So, folks, like anything in the 80s, even just sugary pop like Howard Jones, Thomas Dolby, they all come back to Kraftwerk, don't they?
Absolutely. They all come back, not just to Kraftwerk, but to this album in particular. So thank you so much for doing this show with me, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you're not already subscribed to Rock Daydream Nation, which I find hard to believe, quite frankly, please go and rectify that immediately. I will leave a link in the description as I always do. You will see me on Rock Daydream Nation coming up, no doubt, because Peter and I do shows here and there all the time, and it's a lot of fun. Please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel out. If you're new to the channel, please go and have a look at some of my other videos. I have everything playlisted, so if you want to see some of my other favorite albums of all time shows, I have a playlist for those. If you want to see some of my studio albums ranked shows, I have a playlist for those. And if you want to see my appearances on other people's channels, like Rock Daydream Nation, I also have a playlist for those. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm at bicyclelegs on Instagram, Twitter, and a bunch of other places. I also have a dedicated bicyclelegs Facebook page and bicyclelegs merch. Links are all in the doobly-doo. Please do give those all a follow and join in the conversation. I'd really love to have you there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
See you later.